Welcome to Flyover. Today's guest has degrees from Case Western Reserve University, the University of Florida, and SUNY Buffalo. His impressive career includes academic positions at Oklahoma State University, the University of Buffalo, and Bowie State University. Please welcome Dr. John Shook. All right. Well, I'd like to ask you a couple questions, if that's all right. One of them is sort of a two-part question, though the answer to both questions may be the same, which is why I like to throw them out in the beginning. I, I want people who see this, like prospective students or people who just feel like watching, to get insights, to find a way into philosophy, if they need it. And so I would be interested. Reading is what got you in, and it gets most of us in, and there's no getting around it in the long run. Um, but I was wondering about introductory text, text that could get people moving, and I want to phrase it in two ways. One, what is a good text do you think would work for anybody? In my example of this, just to let you know what I would say is, I think because it for so many reasons, which I could get into, but this is about you, not me. Um, I would say the Euthyphro. I think the Euthyphro by Plato is a great place to start. Um, but then the second part of this question is, and it might possibly be the same text for you, but outside of the text that you think would be a good start for anybody, is there a good text that would be a good way in to your particular branch of philosophy? And so I work in virtue ethics. So for me, I would say the Nicomachean Ethics, by Aristotle. So, what are your one or two books or reads that would be a good way in?
Everybody's so individual. As for just a sort of general book, it could be a novel. Some of the best philosophy is actually done by novelists. I was raised on science fiction. I have a sneaking suspicion that 500 years from now, a history of philosophy that looks back to the 20th century uh, may may have a paragraph in there about John Dewey, maybe a paragraph in there about Putnam or Rorty, but most of it will be about science fiction authors who, in fact, were the most philosophical in the 20th century, and I'd lay money on it that that's true. So it could be great literature, great novels that are winning awards, either Hugo Awards in science fiction or Nobel Awards for literature. But I think a person simply becomes philosophical when they're in the hands of an author that themselves are trying to get at deeper questions about who are we as human beings? What is this world that we're thrown into? What are our best resources that we have for dealing with life's problems? I think the most philosophical book laying around is probably already within reach of a 16-year-old, of a 20-year-old. They just have to give themselves time with it, or maybe an audiobook or a recommendation from a friend. Keep your antennas up. What is turning you on? What is something that just feels right? Because you can't really go wrong as long as it's pulling you in and you feel like doors are opening for you and wider vistas are beckoning. That's all you really need. Great literature, great art, great music is there. You just have to get outside of what you're being force fed. Get out to small bands, get out and hear, some of the shelves at the bookstores that aren't so frequented, and just pick up stuff and dive in. That's the best thing. As for a philosophical book, if somebody's already into philosophy a little bit and they're sort of feeling dissatisfied, I always recommend my guy John Dewey, The Quest for Certainty. It's one of the most important philosophy books of the 20th century. If you just can't get into Heidegger, pick up The Quest for Certainty. It's an easy read, and there he calls balls and strikes. He explains the history of philosophy, where it went right, where it went off the rails, where and why it ended up confusing everybody. And then he shows how philosophy can get back on the right track. And he outlines some of the basic principles, not just of pragmatism, but for doing any kind of philosophy. Well, Dewey is a little bit phenomenological and a little bit existentialist and a little bit humanistic and very naturalistic. So it's really sort of all in there, and it would save folks a lot of time if they picked up The Quest for Certainty at some point, maybe in their second or third year of college. And then they'll never be able to take any other subject the same because they won't fall for the dualistic ideas they'll encounter in psychology. They won't fall for the various ideologies they'll encounter in sociology. They'll approve of various sorts of things going on in cultural anthropology that reduces racism and prejudice. So it's a handy how-to guide for getting through some of the mazes that can be going on in the rest of the disciplines.
Well said. Yeah, I think I get so much out of philosophy and reading philosophy and talking with other philosophers. Um, it's one of the reasons I wanted to do something like this. I actually find philosophers are at their best at conferences, right? Like people, a certain percentage of people there, had to produce work, so there's definitely, that professional, dedicated, edge is still there, but there's also just a lot of informal bouncing, having the opportunity of being all there together and in high spirits, just to bounce ideas off of each other's foreheads.
It's the closest we get to a jazz session of improv. Yeah, you can tell we enjoy that. You
Yeah,
should host such things. Get four of us together, and who knows what'll happen.
thinking about it. We'll see what happens. But I think you are right in a literary sense, in that it doesn't always have to be something that people are screaming at you is philosophical. It needs to be what philosophy is what gives you perspective, right? And new ways of understanding things. I One summer I was taking summer school classes while doing undergrad, and it just happened to match up through no grand planning of my own that at the exact same time I was taking introduction to film and as a separate course philosophy in film.
Hmm.
And one of the things that maybe people who aren't part of the philosophy community now may not understand, it would probably guess incorrectly about what philosophers take seriously. Because I remember the film professor, he used the word philosophy a lot. He'd be like, this film is very philosophical. And what he meant by that was it was dense, most likely in German, like definitely in black and white. There was definitely angels talking to you at some point. Uh, and they were good movies, but it was, and you could see why he would call them philosophical. But again, I'm taking a philosophy and film class at the same time, taught by a philosopher, and we watched The Terminator. There's this. It doesn't have to have all of this, pretense, or just find a way in. It's there. What excites you is worth thinking about.
I right now with my students, I teach a lot of Play-Doh and intro. We talk about television shows they're already watching, not just because I try to stay hip with the pop culture with the kids,
I'm
but there's some
failing.
really great shows. And all I have to do is, we talk about fascism and totalitarianism, and we can talk about episodes from The Boys, the the dark superhero series that's been airing, and the students are like, "Oh, that's Thrasymachus out of Book One of the Republic,"
Yeah.
and they get it. Or we talk about allegory of the cave, I used to be able to bring up the Matrix and have most of the class be able to say, okay, boy, I miss the millennials. The Gen Z, they didn't watch Lord of the Rings or the Matrix so much. So I'm searching around. Some of them have seen Westworld. Uh, I think they got through 3 seasons of it on HBO. Westworld, very philosophical, and it's completely about the allegory of the cave, where it's sort of a cave inside of a cave inside of a cave. Gets a little meta, but you know, you can connect with folks. There's a lot of philosophy to be done, and the arts can do it as well as any book.
A lot of ways in. Who's the worst philosopher ever? Just don't think about it. Just say it. Just say it. No, I
So,
wouldn't. No, go
so
ahead.
I listen to a lot of sports talk. I'm a Buffalo Bills fan, and there's a sports show, and one of the things they like to do is reverse power rankings. So they spend most of their time arguing over who's at the bottom of the AFC or the NFC. Who are the worst philosophers? Well, and it's unfair to pick, you know, the one that's just diametrically opposed to you. So, I mean, you know,
But understandable.
if you wanted the sort of anti-pragmatist we complain the most about, it would be Descartes. But actually, Descartes gets an awful lot right, and us moderns are heavily indebted to Descartes because he was overcoming uh, things that needed to go away from the past. The cleverest thing that I ever saw about the history of philosophy and calling balls and strikes is what you have to realize is if you have a big enough civilization like Western civilization, you can do the same thing with Eastern civilizations. But I mean, you know, big enough and long enough, the great thinkers between them are going to hit on pretty much all of the possible alternatives. It's not unlimited. You so they end up sort of bouncing back and forth, and the civilization swings back and forth whether they need one or the other. There's a terrific book that actually I would recommend very heavily, besides my beloved Dewey. But there's a book called The Cave and the Light. I forget the author. I could grab it off a shelf, but at any rate, I think it's called The Cave and the Light. And he goes back through to the beginnings of philosophy, and he argues convincingly that the easiest way to understand sort of the course of Western civilization, the emergence of the sciences, the arguments back and forth between the centuries, the ancient versus the moderns, the what the Renaissance was about, and then that had to be overcome with the Enlightenment, is that basically it's a friendly argument within the family between Plato and Aristotle. In other words, we'll swing for a couple of centuries into being very Platonic, but that only happened because we went too far in the direction of, you know, the empiricism of Aristotle. But then it has to swing back and forth and back and forth. And it turns out it isn't one or the other that quote unquote gets it right. It's that the back and forth actually turns out to be a helpful circular sort of rising motion, where with each pendulum swing, actually, we're learning much more about how to do science. So sometimes science needs its Platonic phase, and then sometimes it needs to lurch into an Aristotelian phase. And that is just the way it is going to work. The same thing has been happening in psychology. Same thing can be observed happening in anthropology. So it's not just, you know, physics, but it's really more about the conversations, which means to be a very good philosopher, you have to have sat around the table. You have to have seen the world through Platonic eyes, even if you ordinarily prefer sitting in the Aristotelian seat, because at some point the problems are going to get big enough, academic disciplines are going to get stuck enough in the paradigms becoming dogmatic that you need to sort of shake things up. So philosophy needs everybody at the table. Just it can be confusing if everybody's talking all at once, but there's the fun of it. I like to think of it as a big jam band. Sometimes you need the sax solo, and other times you need the keyboards, and sometimes you need the vocalist.
We can Grateful Dead our way through this. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yes, exactly.
Would you say that in traditional, well, through now, but traditional Chinese philosophy that Taoism and Confucianism uh, perform the same way that you were just talking about with Plato and Aristotle?
Oh, yes, and
Yeah.
especially if you add the legalists and the mohists, who were sort of your utilitarian voices, a little bit more empirical. Taoism itself had a philosophical and then a religious track. So by the end of the Han Dynasty and early medieval China was beginning, you had enough schools of thought where you could kind of tell they weren't going to need any more, and the rest of it was going to be a dialectical or interplay of, just as you say, Chinese philosophy does have sort of its core principles. Confucius can be very Taoist, and Taoism can sort of get what Confucius was trying to do, but it's all a family argument. And the nice thing about comparing Western philosophy, European philosophy, particularly with Chinese, is that you can see where um, uh, each one, in some sense, has been playing in a register with a different tonal scale, and now they need each other in order to make sense of what's happening at a global level. Each civilization can carry on just fine, but we've got bigger planetary problems, and we need to get a bigger orchestra together in order to compensate for our own gaps and tin ear. We're not hearing some things that humanity needs, but another civilization has been hearing it. So I find that hopeful. I really encourage any sort of comparative philosophy. Again, not for just the sake of comparison or for trying to figure out where you can sort of mush it all together, but instead to have a bigger band so that new music can be found.
You took us all the way from jam band to orchestra, and that is quite a journey. John, thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me. Let's do this again.
Excellent.